Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm Wendell Wallach from the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, and we're pleased that you came to join us for this little debate about whether we are addicted to algorithms. Now, I'm sure most of you have a rough sense of what an algorithm is, but just to be a little clearer, in the world of information processing, there's information, and then there's the procedures or processes through which that information is manipulated, interpreted, searched, all kinds of different activities. So an algorithm can be very simple from a search for a word, or an algorithm can be very complex, or there can be a collection of algorithms such as the AlphaGo program that beat the Lee Sedol, the best Go player in the world. So for all practical purposes, all software is run by algorithms, or algorithms become the heart of what is done to the information. So given that broad definition, we are talking about an unbelievable expanse of different applications and considerations. And for all of our panelists today, they have all kinds of nuanced considerations. So if they really went through it, they said, well, this is good, this is questionable. But our esteemed debaters today have each agreed to at least take on the role of underscoring the main concerns for the pro or the opposed position for our argument, for our debate. And the way it is formally described, the way the debate is formally described is from search results to social recommendations. Under the surface of every website we visit and application we use are algorithms. The use of algorithms do justify the greater convenience over the loss of our control. Now, as I begin introducing very briefly each of our debaters, I'd like you each to look at the screens around the room, and you'll see that there's a version of that question for you, and there's also a website that if you don't mind going to on your phone, and that website is wef.ch/vote. And the question will appear there: is losing control of our personal data offset by the power and convenience of algorithms? And you'll be asked to vote yes or no. When I have finished doing this very brief introduction, I will then close the voting, and hopefully, if all goes well, we'll get a quick glimpse of what the attitudes are of those of you in the room. But do understand that in our discussion, this is not an Oxford debate. There's not going to be a vote on who's the winner or anything like that. Our debaters have kindly agreed to underscore for all of us some of the key points they want us to consider in relationship to this question. So first of all, let me introduce Michael Altendorf. He's the co-founder and chief executive officer of Adtelligence in Germany. And Michael has agreed to take the pro position. We also have Quentin Clark, and Quentin is the chief business officer and member of the global managing board of SAP USA. And Quentin also has agreed to take the pro position. Rob Leslie, who's the chief executive officer of Sedicii from Ireland, has agreed to take the opposed position. And he is joined by Farida Viz, who is the director of the Visual Social Media Lab in the Faculty of Research Fellow Information School, University of Sheffield. So have all of you voted? So let us close the voting. Okay. And hopefully we will get a view in just a few seconds. If we don't, I'll find a way of filling those few seconds with a few other things to say. But we're going to have in this discussion each of our debaters offering a position. Then we'll have a little bit of a discussion among ourselves, perhaps responding to each other's positions, or perhaps I'll pose some new questions for them. And then we're going to return to you and ask each of you if you have, not each of you, but if there are some questions from the audience that you would like to put to the panel. After which, we will return to this vote, and we'll see if there's any evidence that anyone's mind was changed by our vote. So here we have it. Here's the vote. Is losing control of our personal data offset by the power and convenience of algorithms? Roughly 2/3 of you in the room said it was. So that's the advantage to our pro participants. And 98% of you said no. So that means we have the work cut out for us for our two opposing debaters. So with that, I'm going to turn to Michael Altendorf. And Michael, why don't you outline for us a few of the concerns you have?
So yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So let's start with a small, short description of the status I see the internet of today, and because we're talking about algorithms, but on the one hand, we have these new companies or big companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and even Snapchat, who made algorithms really at the core of their business model, where they make money with engaging the people more and more with the algorithms, ad-based business models, and e-commerce. And on the other hand, we have 80–90% of the traditional websites who have just static websites like a newspaper or textbook. They don't do anything there. And let's start with a good thing. So I think that things like Google search or finding a restaurant in a new city on TripAdvisor, finding stuff on Amazon helps really fast and is really convenient. So imagine you are here outside of the conference center. You have to find back to the airport without your smartphone. It's nearly impossible. So because we haven't done it since years, and you would have to buy a map before, a travel guide. And now we can do it with one click on Google Maps. So I think the smartphone is even playing the bigger role, and with Internet of Things, the amount of data is getting bigger and bigger, and it all comes together in your smartphone. And because of the small screen, there are algorithms needed. So we cannot go into the future without filtering, optimization, and personalization of that. And one of the better things is, okay, imagine if your algorithm in your phone tracks everything, then we go into instead of going to the supermarket, we're looking on the first shelf and everything is already there, instead of walking up and down the aisles. And this is happening already today. If you look at assistants like the new Amazon Alexa, where you just say, buy X, and your payment is connected and it's directly shipped the next day. And this is in your living room. So, but what it means for the individual is, in the end, are we losing control completely? Because if we activate all the services, and especially the apps, our data is gone. And what's happening today is we install the app, but we don't read the terms of services, so we cannot talk about we're losing control, because we could have read it and not install it. But we all want to have this app, so we don't care in the end that they're doing all this stuff, which is 80% good and 20% probably not so good, or over the top, let's say it like this. And I don't think that we lose control, but we lose completely our privacy against that. So, and if we're going further in this direction now, from mobile phones, the next stage is these mobile assistants, and maybe you also got this automatic update of your Windows computer if you have one, and now you have a small screen which is called Microsoft Cortana, and it's a new mobile assistant. Then there is Google Now, there's Amazon Alexa, they're all working on that, or Apple Siri, and these new mobile assistants, they don't do machine learning somewhere in the cloud, and if you like this book, you'll also like the other one. They're using your own data on your phone, and then it becomes really a privacy issue if they do it now on your phone. And because we can talk about cyber stealing your virtual identity, we can talk about different things here, but you don't have a choice, because these assistants are all free to use. And there's no payment option saying, no, my data stays with me and it's not going to my insurance if I order 3 times a week pizza. So this is definitely becoming a big topic, and this is probably here for the discussion. So I'm definitely positive in 80% of the cases, but in terms of privacy and losing control, we definitely should have options to have the other way, to keep our data record. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. So Farida, would you like to let us know what's on your mind?
Okay. So let's focus on the word algorithm. If we focus on this word, I would like to unpack this motion a little bit further to get closer to what I think is at stake. So I want to describe the problem in 3 further iterations, unpacking this word and replacing it in the first instance with the word curation, right? So how would the motion read if instead of algorithms, we talk about curation? So then the motion becomes, the use of curation justifies the greater convenience over the loss of control. And I think this starts to get us a little bit closer to how this decision-making process works. So in the next iteration of this algorithm, if you like, we take a further step, I think, to highlight that this decision-making is done by humans. And so if we think about underpinning decision-making by humans, the motion then becomes something like this. The use of sorting information by humans in particular ways, but largely executed by machines, justifies the greater convenience over the loss of control. So now we really highlight that this is humans and machines, but really humans making decisions. So if you allow me a further final iteration of the motion then, I think this starts to get at what the issue is. The use of sorting information by humans in particular ways, but largely executed by machines, but done in such a way that obfuscates the decision-making process or highlights the assumptions that underline those decisions, justifies the greater convenience over the loss of control. So fundamentally, if we unpack the motion in these 3 further iterations, I think we start to get at what is at stake, that this is fundamentally humans making decisions by humans, about humans, aided by machines. So this is fundamentally about human decision-making. So now that much of our lives is online, let's consider how our digital personas might be very different from our offline persona, right? So what does your digital doppelganger look like? Is it somebody you would recognize, right, in terms of all these digital traces that you've left everywhere? So this digital persona that we have built up over years might be partial and it might be incorrect, and we might not recognize this person. This in turn means that the information that is presented back at us in terms of recommendations and so on might also be impartial or incorrect. So if the information is correct, if our digital persona does map on to an offline person that we recognize, what this means in turn, in terms of algorithms, is that we might then be exposed to information we already know about, or it simply replicates behavior that we have displayed in the past. And so what this means then is that we are not presented with any new, any unexpected, or challenging information, because it simply reproduces us in particular ways. But this is not only about the digital traces that we leave online and the digital persona that we've built up. This is also very much, again, about how other human beings perceive us. This is very much about human biases. And this might then mean that how other humans perceive us is simply problematic. So this is also very much about the human assumptions underpinning this and the limits of the training data, for example, that have been used to build these algorithms. So let us return to the convenience aspect in this motion. What if we put convenience on the spectrum, right? Where on one side of the spectrum, we have purchasing behavior, right? And all of these annoying targeted adverts that we get. And maybe some of us in the room say, well, that's okay. I don't really care that, Facebook advertising gets me wrong. But what if on the other side of that spectrum, we have the convenience to algorithmically influence voting behavior on a population level, right? So this is quite a broad spectrum that I'm sketching out here. So the question then becomes, where do we draw the line? So if this is then only about unjust and problematic assumptions, or could this also be about limiting the possibility to live a richer and fuller life? And these are very, very substantive questions, I think. So for me, the bigger question then becomes about how we can work towards frameworks where there is indeed control, right? And I would dare say accountability. So I would therefore argue against this motion that greater convenience without clear accountability mechanisms does not justify at this point our loss of control when it comes to algorithms.
Okay. Thank you very much. So Quentin, I think you're up next.
Thank you. Just as Freya spoke about decomposing one word, I think the issue really comes down to what loss of control really means, right? And if you take one example that we're all very used to, and you made the example, Michael, about imagine trying to navigate anymore without the phone being able to do that for you. The reality is that specific data of where you have been at any given moment is perhaps capturable and usable for derived purposes. So if you look at traffic data in aggregate, it helps city planners, freeway planners, maintenance, all that stuff, figure out the whens and the wheres and the whats they're going to do as they orchestrate planning for transport in the future, right? And the work they're going to do on freeways and highways. Absent the specificity of it being our information per se, we don't have an objection to that. If it's specifically who was what, where, when, this is when we start to have that objection. So I think this all comes down to loss of control. And there's other examples of this. The mapping data is a good example where Facebook and Google, Bing, et cetera, have created entirely new business models and opened up access worldwide to information to people that it just wouldn't be possible. And it is derived out of the use of information that people are giving up in order to get access to those services. So we're talking now about a fair trade. So what are you getting for what you're giving up? That's the control plane then ultimately that you're trying to work with. Medical field's the same way. It turns out most human beings, when they're asked, they're perfectly willing to give away information if they believe it will contribute to improving the state of medical science. They'll make that conscious choice. Well, how often can we make that choice on behalf of certain classes of information, even if we have or have not chopped off certain personally identifiable components of that information? It turns out a lot of people will not object to moving forward research, even if they believe that information may exist somewhere that could potentially personally identify them. So we're back to that thing about personal or loss of control, and this difference between the information about a specific instance of something someone has done versus that information in aggregate or pooled together with other like information to being put to purpose for some other greater good. In the marketing space, we talk a lot about this market of one phenomenon, right? Where a lot of people will, when you sit down and you talk to them about it, they actually want this. They don't, you know, my wife and I, we're long past having children. We don't need advertisements in our streaming media for diapers. I'm not sure why something happened somewhere in our IP address that they think this is something we're really interested in, but nonetheless some algorithm somewhere believes it so, because in part the algorithm's hampered by this notion that it cannot be specific to us. It has to treat us as one of a class of people that they've modeled, and they've somehow modeled not quite granular enough, right? Not quite specific enough. So we're willing to give up some loss control what happens to that data if only we were being given, you know, services and exposure to things that are appropriate to the situation we're in. So to wrap that up, I think a lot of it has to do with this. In fact, the whole question's framed a little bit loaded. Loss control, human beings, that's not an acceptable answer, that we're going to lose control. So really the question needs to be, are we willing to accept a high degree of loss of control? Are we willing to have some opacity over the derived use of the information or to get the convenience of services that are being offered to us? And that's where things get a little bit more interesting.
Rob, you're on.
So once upon a time, I was a computer programmer. And in my world, an algorithm essentially was a set of computer steps that would arrive at a decision at some point in time at a certain set of inputs and a certain set of outputs. It was a logical process. So look at a computer and look at a human. What is the difference between a human and a computer? Humans are able to be completely illogical. They can do weird things at weird times. Computers don't. They do what you tell them to do. So things like creativity, originality, emotions, Computers fundamentally don't have these things. They learn stuff about you and try to mimic them, but they are not performing those emotional things that we as humans do. So I would argue that the essence of being human is our creativity, and to ask a computer to try and recreate that is a huge mistake because it will fundamentally fail. It is not capable of being illogical. If I look at what I did when I was a 10-year-old, I would be outside playing in the fields, climbing trees, fighting with my brothers and sisters. If I look at my 10-year-old daughter, she doesn't spend her time, her free time, out messing around outside. She spends her time on her phone or on her tablet. By the time she was 3 years old, she was going up to the TV and putting her finger on the TV and trying to drag stuff around the place. The nature of our children has changed. And one of the things that concerns me is all the information that she is now putting into that device, that it is learning about her, is giving her information back that they believe is correct and appropriate for her. But maybe it isn't. What if our computers are informing our children in a way that we don't think is appropriate? Just like the example of diapers being served when you don't want to get them. So there's a danger there that algorithms have gone too far, that they're trying to replace the essence of our humanness. I think this is something that we've got to be really, really careful of and judicious in our decision. Are we losing the ability to question and challenge because we take stuff for granted when it is served to us? When Google says, this is the way to the airport, we just trust it. How many times has Google Maps told me to go down a street and it is a dead end? Plenty of times. Or there's a traffic jam and there isn't a traffic jam. So we've got to be very judicious and careful in how we approach these things and not be preconditioned to accept the status quo as it is presented to us. Now, I was joking with somebody yesterday about Brexit. And this is just my personal opinion. I'm not informing a political decision here in any way. Was it an emotional decision that the population of Britain made? And some people would argue potentially it was. And we jokingly said, well, what if there was an app that allowed Mr. Cameron to put all the arguments, economic, social, and then weight those arguments according to someone's social interactions and give them a recommendation, vote Remain or vote Stay? Would the outcome have been different? I would argue potentially it might have been. Again, are we replacing human decision-making, emotional behavior with something that is inherently logical? So overall, I think we need to be very, very careful about trying to replace human emotion with something that is fundamentally ours. It makes us different from machines. Keep the machines good at what the machines do, and let the humans do what the humans do well, is what I would say to sum it all up.
Well, thank you all for being so succinct. Most appreciative. So it gives us a little bit extra time to talk together. And I want to start, since we finished up with an opinion that opposed the motion, then I would like to go to those those of you who spoke for the motion. I wonder if you have some specific challenges based on the comments that the other debaters make that you would like to raise, either Michael or Quentin.
Yeah, so I'm from Germany, so sure, we have a big privacy discussion ongoing. This is definitely a big point where we should, if we go to the political election system, then it's even going further, but we can start with privacy topic, we can start with a political election. That the question is more, when do algorithms become really a filtering and a changing of the reality, or try to balance us? So we discussed it before already with the topic of bias. Are we going too much in this or that direction? The algorithm can just reinforce this, but will not bring us back to a neutral kind of position. So here we definitely
So you agree on that point. Is there something that either of the two opponents of the proposition have said that you would challenge or just outright disagree or want them to clarify more? Do you have anything?
I don't know if I would outright challenge. I would just say that making an assumption that a convenience, which is kind of the way the problem is framed, it implies that we're not applying human judgment to what those conveniences are, is a little too far, right? I mean, the devil here is always going to be in the detail in terms of, again, just like we talk about loss of control, we talk about what the conveniences are. Who's designing what those conveniences are in the first place? We're not talking this debate about a complete loss of even defining what it is that we want the machines to do for us. Ultimately, just like when you're programming still, we are ultimately in control of how we're defining those conveniences. And so I don't think we're in a situation where we're giving over control of our entire lives or the entire control of society over to machines. This is the discussion we're having. We have to define what those conveniences are and then decide what information we're willing to lose control over to get to it.
So now those two of you who spoke against the proposition, you came with pre-prepared marks. I wondered if there's anything that the two pro-participants said that you would like to challenge directly.
Well, I would like to return to the diaper example, actually. So everybody a little bit chuckled, when you said, my wife and I still get these adverts for diapers, and you rightly highlighted that this wasn't at a very personal level. They weren't targeting you and your wife specifically, because then they probably wouldn't have done that. They targeted you as part of a class of people who most likely could still have children, for example, and are therefore maybe in the diaper buying market. So I just want to flip that example a little bit, because if we're talking about classes of people, if we, instead of talking about diapers, if we talk about social deprivation, or if we talk about class, or if we talk about race, I do think that there is an issue that is a lot less funny than having a chuckle about diapers, when people as a whole class get written off or get stigmatized in ways that have very serious implications within the legal system. For example, in terms of predictive policing, or the way in which whole classes of people might be almost condemned to be, deemed to be at risk, second offenders, or for example. So I just want to unpack that a little bit, that we recognize maybe that there isn't so much an issue when it comes to aggregate personalization in terms of personal buying choices that we don't find terribly offensive. But these mechanisms are not that different from condemning groups of people in terms of criminal activity or issues around social deprivation. And so I think that it has the potential to then lock people in a particular way that limits their potential, which kind of comes back to your point about your 10-year-old daughter. And so I think that's really worth unpacking, that whilst on the one hand those decision-making processes can be as inoffensive as that, they are on the other side also responsible for things that I think we should really think about a lot more, and have very grave consequences, I think, for society.
And just to pick up on the last point there that Quentin made in terms of applying judgment to the stuff that we create, that works in a logical environment. But again, we are not necessarily logical. There are good people and there are not so good people. There are some extremely talented programmers out there that will create magnificent algorithms to do really bad stuff that is not necessarily in the common good. The ultimate scenario is it's going to cause someone to die, whether that is a Terminator drone, or somebody messing around with a car that suddenly goes veering off a bridge somewhere. These are the kind of things that can happen when rogue software gets out there. And I don't mean to use that term in terms of the software going nuts. It was told to do something by somebody. And these are the things that I think we've got to be very, very careful of. So, the ethics of coding is something that I don't think we talk enough about. What software is used for and how it is used. Where I come from in Ireland, we have a a coding school for kids. Literally, they start as young as 4 years old, and by the time they're 10, 12 years old, these guys are producing some pretty sophisticated software, but they're not necessarily told, use it for good purposes. There was an incident in Northern Ireland where there was a 15-year-old boy running a criminal enterprise from his bedroom with exploit kits that he downloaded from the internet for $20, hacked into some corporate databases, stole some information, and was selling it for Bitcoin on the dark web. And his mother and father thought he was playing on his PlayStation. These are the kind of things that happen when stuff goes really tragically wrong. And I just worry sometimes that we haven't got the balance right and the structures that need to go around that.
But I think we're kind of far afield from the question that was posed, right? Which is about the giving up control of specific information in order to get the benefit of services that are being built around it. I mean, throughout all of humanity, people have taken capabilities that have been developed, whether it's economics and banking, right, and done bad things with it long before there was, either program, deterministic programming, or there was something that was a little more indeterministic with programming based on machine learning and algorithmic data, right? And this question about data clarity and somewhere between grouping all people together and having full visibility by anybody that wants it into any specific person's life is some zone of where people are going to end up being comfortable with the deal they get, the value that they get ultimately. And we're willing to give up certain information if it means that the services are going to be, we're going to get the value of that, and we don't see, or aren't made explicitly aware of potential downside, right? So it's not just the existence of algorithms themselves, and yeah, I mean, all sorts of bad stuff will continue to happen, right? Because there's people out there.
So before we turn to our audience questions, I want to put two questions to you. First, to the proponents, I'd like to push a bit beyond what Farida raised, which is I suspect that neither of you is okay with explicit biases or prejudices being part of the algorithmic processes. But how about algorithms that are designed in a way that they have a particular end? They are driving people to buy specific products. Or algorithms that have implicit values, the values of the corporation, without necessarily being sensitive to what are the algorithms of other communities who may use these tools. And finally, I think there's a kind of implicit prejudice, which is that we're all being trained, slowly but surely, to buy into a digital view of the universe. Not just what we're doing online, but everything is digitized. And that's a whole view on life, the information age view on life, that there are many other competing views. So this is just for the two proponents. Are any of those concerns for you?
I think partly you're sure right, but on the other hand, I think you still have the freedom of choice not to use Amazon or one of these purchase algorithms who help you buy more. I think there's always a balance, and sure, if you have an e-commerce shop, the target of the shop is to sell something. Yeah. You cannot tell the algorithm, maybe you sell different kinds of things and not always the same, but this will not change it, or that you have baskets or whole clusters of products. This will not change the problem. It's more like we should more have the freedom of choice, how are we using it. And I think on an e-commerce, it's clear what the algorithm is doing. I think more in the political sector, it's more problematic when it's anonymous that something has happened, or it's not clear for the user what's happening there. And there we can talk about code ethics or what kind of education for children, what to build and what not to build. But finally, the e-commerce algorithm will be built for selling. So,
yeah, I think the biases are built by the people.
Yeah.
The biases are generated because a data set used to train a model is incomplete. Why is it incomplete? Because a person brings their own biases to bear. They collect certain information they think is what's the relevant remit, and they don't have the awareness to go beyond that. And that trains this poor machine that doesn't know any better. It's just logical, right? It was fed this, and now it's regurgitating. It doesn't know any different. And so, what do we do in terms of, and this gets kind of a little bit to the ethics question, right? What do we do in terms of even data curation to help us understand how we go about making sure we have appropriate, wide enough data sets that teach the machines about the whole world, not just the parts of it we as individuals understand.
But I think there are ongoing questions of it. Is it just the machine's regurgitation, or is it the process by which the machine was trained? The very beginning of the algorithm was designed by the corporation, by the programmers working for that corporation. But let me go to a question for our two opponents here. You've come up with criticisms, but neither of you seem to be Luddites. Neither of you are saying that we should give up our machines altogether, or perhaps I missed something there. So given that you aren't saying that, you seem to accept, to some extent, this digital universe we have created and some of the conveniences it has brought about for us. So if you had to each mention one very specific reform that you would require, what would that be? Let's start with Farida.
A difficult question. I think I want to return to the issue around control and accountability and freedom of choice, and kind of think a little bit about algorithmic literacy. Because I think when we talk about control and we talk about choice, I think we need to be educated in order to be able to make choices, right? And we need mechanisms that allow us to give more control, or allow us to say, I'm okay with these things, but not others. And so I think, absolutely, we are now in this digital age where, if we're talking about some of the examples that have been highlighted here, we have a number of companies, say Facebook, Apple, Google, Amazon, that are very, very dominant in this space. And so this is where I struggle a little bit with the idea of freedom of choice. If I want to buy books online, I don't really have that much choice, which is a slightly different problem. But then I also think we need to think about mechanisms that allow users and citizens more control over their choices in terms of what happens with that data, right? So if I'm happy to buy books on Amazon, am I happy for all of that data also to be used by Facebook, and for all of that data also to be used by insurance companies, or to be sold to, a manufacturer of diapers for targeted advertising, right? So I think it's more about how the control is managed and implemented, and the mechanisms through which users are given more or less control and can opt out. Because at the moment, the mechanisms for users to opt out are very blunt. It's either you tick the terms of service, which everybody does but nobody really reads, or you don't use the service.
So let us move quickly on to Rob then.
And when you asked the question, that was the first thing that came to mind for me, which is when I'm asked in an app, am I willing to give control to all of these different services, my microphone, my camera, my photos, my emails, my contacts, everything pretty much. It's a binary yes or no, accept it, or you don't get to use the service. Well, what if there was a third choice? You can give it away, all of it, for free, or you could pay me $5 a year. How many people would click on the $5 a year in order to consume the service but not have to give away all their information? It comes back to, at the end of the day, how much is your information really worth? And how do people equate the service they're getting with the value of that information? I mean, the European Union did a study, and the average annual value of a person's data for all the apps that they consume came out at about 2,000 euros. And most people to think, I'm worth 2,000 euros to all the service providers that gather that information from my phone, It goes up, it goes down, depending on who you are and how often you use your phone and where you go and all these different variables that go into it. But that's a staggering sum of money when you take into it. And yet, do we get 2,000 euros worth of value back? And I'd say probably not. That's their profit. That's where they make their money. So for me, I would love to have the ability to decide I'm going to pay you for the service you provide me. I would also like to be able to choose, I'm giving you access to my emails, I'm giving you access to my contacts, or not. So case by case, I consume the BBC, for example, and they ask for all these different things. You're just giving me news. Why do you need all my personal information? You don't.
So they want
because they're going to resell it.
Well,
I'll be the first one to say, I think as a society, we have been very quick to sell everything for some baubles, right? We have sold everything about ourselves for the ability to, hit some birds and poke someone, make fun of their picture or whatever, and all this kind of nonsense. We have sold everything about ourselves for nothing. And I think most it's because we are incredibly uneducated about what it is we've actually chosen to. Well, not even chosen. We didn't even make a choice. We just did it without considering it. And it's part because you opened up these EULAs, right? And they're 16 pages of legalese, and they're ununderstandable. And that in our industry has to completely change. And we have to, as consumers, start demanding much clearer terms and use rights. That we can really understand what it is we're giving.
So let us give our audience a chance to raise questions. I'm sure something has popped up. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in the question of disenfranchised communities. There is a way of targeting disenfranchised communities inappropriately, but it seems to me that if there is no way for content providers, service providers, to be able to target certain communities, they will only provide content and services for the majority or for those who have the most money, which means that content creation then gets targeted at only rich white males. And so the absence of granularity could have the unintended consequence of making minority communities invisible in the digital world.
Okay.
The first thing that comes to mind is, why can I not declare what my preferences are? And volunteer them rather than waiting to be figured out and put into a certain box. And in that way, I can actually determine, I want to go to exactly that spot because I've chosen to go there, not because an algorithm has chosen to put me there. And it's switching the decision-making process around, I think. And that's one of the things that I think we're going to see in the next period of time, is where the user is going to get a lot more control over the decision-making process. With the GDPR coming into force in Europe, where essentially a user is going to own his own data and will be able to choose how and when that data is consumed by the organization, it changes the dynamic completely.
I think we had that in the first generation of the internet when we all applied for email. They asked for all these preferences to send us advertising emails. We did that, but I think the newer generation of sites, they just didn't do it because they knew that you will subscribe much faster if they ask whatever on 16 pages you cannot see. So I think we had that, and the question is more, how do we get that back? With education of the user, with regulation? That's, I think, more the topic, that we cannot see all the same ad. It's not even happening on TV nor on newspapers. So I think this is clear, but the question is more, how do we pragmatically or operationally then implement that?
We have some other questions from our audience. Yes, sir. I think it's this gentleman, and then we'll turn to you. Okay.
So this has been a great debate, so thank you. Our current legal framework around this is to treat this like a commercial contract, that if I give up my rights, I can use your website for free. My question to the panel is this the right legal framework to actually regulate this space? I mean, should we treat the use of websites like we treat consumer goods? That if you buy and you accept the terms, you have to live with the consequences. Is this the right way to handle this?
Yeah, I don't really think so. Right now, it's an all for nothing sort of proposition, right? Like you're saying, it's like the BBC, like, you know, it needs to see all the pictures of everything you've ever taken in your entire life, or you don't get to read the news. Is a ridiculous proposition, effectively, right? And so I think we're going to have to find our way to a much clearer value proposition back to the customer. What exactly are you giving up? What's going to be done with it? What are you going to get back in return? And it may take a couple of, I don't know, I mean, the wrong word is crisis, but it may take a couple of very notable examples and things that have gone wrong for people to start caring exactly what's going to happen. But at some point, I believe we will come to a state of maturing around this, where we're going to realize we're not getting all the things that we thought we should, and we're getting some things we didn't want from what we gave up, and we're going to start wanting to have more control. And that means that the relationship is going to be less like the consumer product goods, where it's a single transaction basically with no other constraints around it, and one that is going to end up being much more constrained. And that data use rights is going to become a thing that we start to understand as consumers.
Sir, yes.
It's about algorithm for personalization. So from what I understand, you take raw data and you build a machine, a kind of black box that can answer questions and make proposals, okay? And the raw data themselves, they have less value. At the end of the day, it's a black box that has the value. So my question is about sharing, transferring what is in the black box, because it's a program, okay? It's not a data, so I cannot copy, paste, or transfer. And are the different actors able to, let's say, share or transfer or trade this information? What I put on Google, Apple doesn't know. What I put on Apple, Google doesn't know. So is there a possibility that all this information is shared, okay? And you have a 360 view of people.
It sounds like a question over control over what gets shared between the websites. Is that correct?
No, it's the fact that today, let's say I buy on Amazon, let's say I buy only books.
Yeah.
So Amazon has a learning machine on my preferences for books, on which they can infer a number of things. Okay, on Google I do other things. So each of them has a partial view of what I am. Okay. And my question is, if you want to have a complete view, you need to associate these machines, and how is it technically possible? Okay.
So
and can it be traded? I mean,
thank you.
Can it be? Is this information, exchange against money between the actors?
Farida, did you want to say something to this?
Yeah, because this gets to the point of around transparency, which we haven't really discussed so much. And I think the problematic assumption that there is a way to make the black box transparent and to sort of somehow open it up and to sort of see the algorithm and see how it behaves. And I think one of the things that we haven't really talked about yet is the more technical aspects around machine learning, for example, where, you know, I think the idea that we can understand how PageRank works in relation to Amazon or in relation to Facebook, these are also social machines that are dynamic and adaptive, and it's very difficult to almost set up an artificial experiment and says, you know, if you take these kinds of actions, this will always be the outcome. That's not how these things work. So there isn't really a 360 view on you. It really is situated, contextual, and you know, and therefore very complicated. So I think the desire to open up the black box and to kind of like shine the light of transparency on these things is a slight red herring. And I think what we ought to be really discussing, and it comes a little bit back to your points, is values. What do you bake into these machines? What are the values with which these machines execute? What are the things that you allow them to do? What are the data sources that you allow them to pull in, and so on? Mm-hmm. And I think that gets us also beyond this, I think, somewhat problematic idea that transparency is going to fix this all. I think this needs to be a discussion about values and what we feel comfortable about, how much control we give up, or what we allow these machines to do. And that's a slightly different conversation, I think.
Michael, do you want to respond to that?
So not directly to her point, but more to the question. So yes, there are pages who are sharing data with each other, whatever. There are fixed APIs between eBay and Facebook, and they exchange a lot of data. There is more like the wallet garden. What is Apple more doing? So they don't like to give data away. They like to keep it, more or less, but for own business reasons. And in terms of algorithms, I think if you read the papers, how PageRank works, like 80% we know, but we would never get the same search result because that's the purpose of the algorithm in the end, to personalize. That's one thing. But on the other hand, I think nobody really wants that we have a 360. So maybe me personally, I want to have this 360 view to know what's all there, but I don't want that they all share it with each other, especially without transparency, without educating the people what they are doing. I think there are a lot of stuff ongoing in Northern America, which is really problematic for Europeans, I would say.
So we're going to move on
moral behavior.
I want to thank our debaters for what's been an excellent discussion, but now we're going to move back to the audience participation part of our activity, and we're going to bring up the question again. You can all see that, so go on your phones to the website wef.ch/vote and vote on this question. Is losing control of our personal data offset by the power and convenience of algorithms? And I'm going to give you just about a minute or so to vote on that. I think you will have all noticed that there was actually a little bit of convergence from both sides as we were talking, and the convergence was an acknowledgement that perhaps there does need to be an evolution toward more user control, though there might be differences of opinions about how we will get there or whether we can get there and exactly what the tools we might be able to put into place for more user control. So again, has everybody completed their vote? Do you all need a few more seconds here? Okay, here we go. So that's interesting. In the group now, we have more people who feel that the proponents, if not won the debate, they at least are more likely to agree with the proponents. That might be slightly reflected by the fact that we saw a little change in the people in the room throughout our discussion here. But now to finish up, I would like to give each of our speakers 1 minute or less to state what they think is the most essential point that has come out of this debate. Michael.
So I think to wrap it up, it's really like what we talked in the end. We need education of the user, we need transparency, we need to talk about what set of values we want to bring into the people who design the algorithms or in the algorithm itself. And especially, I think, for the next step of this kind of mobile assistance, we really have to think about how do we educate the people who are now buying all these devices or get it upgraded without asking, that they exactly know what's happening there and that they have a freedom of choice maybe between the paid model, what Netflix and Spotify, they really show that we are happy to pay for convenience and that they're getting good music and movies. I think why should this model not work on the other pages, but in terms of keeping our privacy, for example?
Rita.
So I think in terms of the points around control and accountability, I think there's a larger discussion around, what might those different mechanisms be and what might those different scenarios, if you like, look like. And so for me, it's a question also about how can we have these discussions with users, right? So we're having this discussion at a very, very high level here, but I think if we look at different scenarios, in the kind of worst case scenario, nothing changes, and maybe the gold standard scenario is the user is in total control and is maybe on a complete equitable footing with the company that is processing the user's data. And I think for me, the question out of this discussion has been a little bit, what could WEF do to further facilitate these discussions? So what could the people in the room do to further facilitate these discussions? What can, the 4 panelists do to push for more, debate and discussion so that we can start to move towards models that do feel better and more comfortable that allow users greater control. So that would be my takeaway. What can we all do in this room to further facilitate this discussion?
Thank you. Thank you. Quentin.
Yeah, I think we also recognize that there's a certain inevitability that the field of computer science and the application of machine learning and algorithmic technology to understanding the information around us, that's inevitable. This is just the way the industry is going. I think it comes down to ethics, right? And this gets a little bit to the point of these are tools. Humans wield the tools. What are they wielding it for? What is their purpose? I think there is certainly something to be said around transparency, people understanding what they're doing and what they're getting involved with, and protection when on the deal that they have. So if they believe they're giving up this information for these purposes, that data needs to be guarded and trusted to those entities or those institutions, and they have to take that very, very seriously. And then finally, I think that the thing that is at the heart of all this is the value that's returned. Mm-hmm. People have to understand the value they're getting out of what they're giving. They have to understand what they're even giving to get that value. And that's where this education and this dialogue has to start accelerating a little bit.
And I completely concur with everything. The value exchange, I think, is absolutely critical. The consumer has got to get more back than they're currently getting. It's a pretty raw deal that the consumer is getting today. The second thing that I think is very important is consistency in some critical things like privacy, for example. There's a clear divergence of thought between what happens in Europe in relation to how data is managed and controlled and what happens in the US. Yet, when we look at an app, we don't know whether the data is going to Europe or to the US and how that data is being managed. So there has to be some convergence there in terms of how standards are applied to the management of our data. So those two things are what I would leave you with.
So just in summary, I think in spite of the vote, it was largely a convergence in viewpoints, only in the sense that you don't have to give up your apps tomorrow. You don't have to give up using algorithms tomorrow, but all four of our participants are very concerned about the ethical use of some of the data, the privacy concerns, the biases that might be built in, and all four seem to have expressed a desire for an evolution, both in consumers' understanding of what they're buying into, but also in terms of consumers having more control of the algorithms they are utilizing. So I want to thank you all for what has truly been an excellent discussion and fascinating that we had this convergence.
Thank you.
Thank you.